Good morning and welcome to this Fiscal Matters event. I am just going to wait maybe 30 more seconds until we let a few more participants into the room, and then we'll just get kicked off. Okay, so welcome and good morning, or good afternoon, I should say. I've said that twice now. This event is called Fiscal Policy, Inequality, Productivity, and the Green Transition Nexus. It's hosted by the New Economics Foundation and E3G. Thanks for coming. I am super excited about this event because it really covers a raft of different things and possibly some of the bigger challenges that we're really facing in terms of how we design our fiscal framework moving forwards. Just very quickly on the Fiscal Matters Coalition and this week of events, we were effectively, as many of you know, the Commission is reviewing the effectiveness of the Union's fiscal governance framework, and it's inviting all stakeholders to publicly debate its future. So in this spirit, a group of civil society organizations, think tanks, and trade unions have effectively come together to organize this week around the European fiscal framework. It's very much done under the guise that we think in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, many important decisions were taken quickly and behind closed doors. And we found it striking that there was neither an EU-wide inclusive and accessible policy debate on how to recover from the crisis, and nor an advocacy or influencing campaign demanding it. So we felt very much like this time must be different, and to build back better so that Europe is stronger coming out of COVID than it was going in, we need to build consensus. We need to make sure, all perspectives are heard, and we all need to work so that everyone is informed as much as possible and able to have their say in the future of fiscal policy. About this event in particular, and why I'm super excited about it, it's derived very much from the idea that productivity is an enabler of higher wages and better living standards. And in the view of a suite of environmental challenges facing us, from climate change to species extinction to resource scarcity, being able to do more, or at least the same with less, also represents an important tool in the project to basically embed our economies within sustainable planetary limits. Now, there's at least one of two significant problems facing all European economies. One, there's too often the majority of productivity gains are captured by the richest people in society. And two, growth in productivity is either stalling and or outpaced by asset inflation, often triggered by monetary policy without a accommodative fiscal stance alongside it. So both these issues increase levels of inequality and don't necessarily raise the living standards for the majority of people. This puts increasing pressure on output growth and moves us further away from reaching our environmental goals. So basically solving the shared problems of the inequality, productivity, and green transition nexus is possibly one of the greatest challenges facing the Eurozone. Inherently, we believe that supply-side policies like corporate governance, industrial strategy, and finance are definitely important parts of this conversation. But we're here today to ask if there's a bigger role for demand management through fiscal policy. Just one very quick announcement. Unfortunately, we had Yanis Varoufakis as our keynote speaker today. He's had a bereavement within the family and is unable to make it. We extended him our fullest condolences, and he's expressed a deep and sincere apology for not being able to make it today. So what we're going to do is just go straight to the panel session, which will begin with some opening remarks. I will first pass it over, however, to our amazing moderator, Teresa Harrer. I completely forgot it. I'm so sorry, Teresa, who is a research fellow at CUSP, the Center for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity.
Thanks, Frank. I think you actually did very well. So, thanks for the nice introduction, and also a very warm welcome from my side. And I'm really excited to be part of that panel as a moderator today. I'm joined by Maria Inequality, who is an associate professor at the University of Greenwich in the UK. I'm joined also by Eric Lonergan, who is a writer and an economist. Unfortunately, Margit Schratzenstaller-Alzinger couldn't make it. There were a lot of things going on in her schedule, I think, as well. So she sends her apologies for not being able to participate as well. I'm also joined by Ronan Palmer, who is the Associate Director of E3G. And I'm joined by Anna Sofia Pessoa, who is from the University of Bonn. Very welcome to all of you. And I'm just going to hand it over to the panelists, actually. Each of them is going to give a short, sort of 5-minute teaser on what they think are the key challenges or how we should move forward in terms of fiscal policy after the pandemic. And Maria, I want to invite you to start.
Thanks. Let me share my screen first. Hope you can see it. Let me know if not. Many thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this panel. I would like to briefly talk about the links between productivity, inequality, climate change, and fiscal policy. I will focus first on the vicious cycles that we are now experiencing because of the current fiscal policy framework. And then I would like to show you how we can transform this fiscal policy framework in order to have more sustainable relationships. So I will present these relationships by having a systems-based approach in which we take into account the interaction between the climate system, an economy system, and the social system. We'll use the system-based approach instead of using this partial analysis that in most cases is being used in order to talk about debt sustainability. So, as we know, we are now facing a continuous increase in atmospheric temperature. As a result of this, we might have an increasing number of floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and so on and so forth. As a result of this, governments might need to step in order to deal with the economic losses that are caused because of climate change, and they also might need to protect people, for example, by building flood defenses. As a result of this, the debt to GDP ratio of the government might go up. So this is not only because of higher adaptation spending, but also because of lower GDP due to climate damages. So as we know, when we have these floods, these hurricanes, capital, which includes factories and houses, are destroyed. And as a result, we have less economic activity. With the current existing fiscal policy framework, some of the governments might need to reduce their spending because they want to avoid this increase in debt to GDP ratio. Some of the governments might decide that actually have increased their adaptation spending, might want to compensate this with lower other types of spending, such as green and social spending. In this case, the lower spending will lead to a resource productivity that might not improve. So let's say energy and resources might not be used in an effective way, and as a result, we might have more global warming, even more global warming. So we have a vicious cycle that has been created because of the existing fiscal policy framework. Again, we have a decline in social spending, and this might lead to a worsening of inequality. We also know that global warming affects directly inequality, so this will even further worsen inequality. And we have that climate change will affect in a negative way, labor productivity. So in this case, and taking into account the bargaining power of workers, we might experience lower wages. So in this case, this will reinforce even more the worsening of inequality. So by looking at the current fiscal policy framework from a system-based approach, we can understand that we are trapped in various vicious cycles. Can we deal with these cycles? The answer is yes, but we need to view fiscal policy in a different way. So first, we need to understand that an increase in green spending can improve the CO2 intensity. So we'll have less CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and as a result, we might not have a substantial increase in atmospheric temperature. In this case, some of the governments might not have a lot of adaptation spending, which might not allow the debt to GDP ratio to become higher. Or second, we need to take into account that higher green and social spending will increase economic activity. So this increase in economic activity will increase sales, and will have more investment from firms, which can lead to a higher labor productivity. So this is linked with the Carter-Verduin's law. In this case, and with a combination of stronger bargaining power of workers, we might have higher wages and an improvement in quality. And obviously, social spending affects directly quality, and we expect an improvement. So overall, by disconnecting the fiscal policy framework from looking at the current debt to GDP ratio and the fiscal targets, we can target equality, labor productivity, and environmental sustainability. So let me finish by pointing out that within this framework, we can also analyze, I think it's necessary actually to take into account that we might need a change in consumption patterns and in order to deal with the existing climate crisis. And I would be happy to talk more about that at our discussion later. Many thanks. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Maria. I'll just hand over straight away to Eric, and we are gonna collect questions after that. So if anyone has any questions, either remember them or put them in our Q&A, so we can pick them up after the introductory panel. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm just going to make really three observations. The first one on fiscal rules, the second one on the role that fiscal policy can play within the green transition, and then finally, the role that fiscal policy can play with respect to inequality, and specifically to wealth inequality. The first one with respect to fiscal rules is, I think it is very, very important when we're having discussions and when we're engaging with the public and ultimately as citizens within Europe and as economists, to be really honest about the way fiscal policy actually works. And the first observation I would make is that the fiscal rules actually follow the economic reality rather than determining the economic reality, right? So broadly speaking, fiscal rules have had probably not even second, third, or fourth order impact on fiscal outcomes. They just adapt. So what happens is we get fiscal outcomes. So broadly speaking, we do, very broadly speaking, let's put the euro crisis to one side. We do sensible things with fiscal policy because they're determined by what we have to do, and we broadly know what we have to do. And then the fiscal rule desperately tries to catch up after the event and try and explain it and adapt it. So in one sense, what I'm actually saying is, don't worry too much about the fiscal rule because it's a kind of lagging variable of reality. The other point I think is very important to be honest about here is that there actually is a kind of real world fiscal rule. And the real world fiscal rule is that the most important variable is the relationship between the government's cost of debt and the rate of growth of nominal GDP. This is a really, really simple and obvious point. And the truth is, we didn't have to wait for Olivier Blanchard to change his mind and observe this with lots of equations. This has been pretty obvious to the entire world in terms of how it's been operating for the last 15 or 20 years. So the easiest way to think about it is if you imagine you had 100% debt GDP ratio and your economy is growing at 4%. So in kind of a sort of steady state, your economy compounds at 4%. And your interest rate is 2%, your debt is compounding at 2%, you can pretty much run a deficit in perpetuity and your debt to GDP ratio won't rise. So now you can show this with fiscal equations, and there are lots and lots of papers that illustrate this. But that is also, if you look at it, what's happened in practical reality. So if you look at the global economy during COVID, where were we able to ease fiscal policy? It was by and large, huge fiscal policy easing was done with no ramifications for anybody because government bond yields across the developed world sit way, way below nominal GDP growth in terms of trend. There's one or two exceptions, which we should come back to, but broadly that is the case. And that is the real, that is the operating environment that economies are actually living in. If you look at the serious phases where economies have actually engaged in dramatic fiscal tightening, apart from some arbitrary acts of self-harm, they've only ever really been forced on economies when interest rates have been skyrocketing. In other words, when interest rates are going up a lot and are higher than nominal GDP growth, actually you have no choices in the economy. If you want to stabilize the system, you have to tighten fiscal policy. So as a result, if you just think of the European fiscal rules, they haven't actually been relevant. They were only relevant to an extent during the euro crisis, and it wasn't really about fiscal rules. It was really about a huge misconception of how economies work, which is if you tighten fiscal policy into a market panic, you actually make the panic worse, and that just destroys economies, which if you look at the legacy of that in terms of the Italian debt to GDP ratio, it was absolutely traumatic. The hope now is that we've learned that lesson. But I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to start by being absolutely honest on this. The reason everybody within the kind of policy-oriented macroeconomic community is saying change the fiscal rules is not because they've learned more economics. It's because the world's changed on them. And we went from, in fact, Olivier Blanchard's very clear about this. We went from an assumption that interest rates would be roughly the same as nominal GDP, or indeed higher, to a world where we've now been in a 15-year world where interest rates have been way below nominal GDP. So it makes no sense to have the same set of fiscal objectives. So that is the reality. And broadly speaking, I think that's quite an optimistic reality, because I think the secular forces that have caused interest rates to fall relative to nominal GDP haven't gone away. There is one caveat to that, which is, I think, the case of Italy, and we can maybe come back to that, but it is quite preoccupying because Italy's nominal GDP has been so appallingly low for such a prolonged period of time that it's one of the few developed economies where it wouldn't take much for bond yields to go above trend nominal GDP growth. And Italy also has a very high debt to GDP ratio. So broadly speaking, the main thing that European policymakers should be thinking about everywhere is they must not cause any sort of sovereign run within the Eurozone, because if that were to reoccur, there will by definition be a major fiscal problem. That's the first point. The second point that I want to make is that, and this is absolutely relevant to the green transition, is that we are actually the most fortunate generation in human history for a very simple reason, which is our biggest economic challenge is one of capital expenditure. And our cost of capital is the lowest in human history. Right? That is actually a huge opportunity. Why is that a huge opportunity? For a very simple reason. And this goes back to the second most important dimension of fiscal policy, which is the difference between current expenditure and capital expenditure. Right? So the green transition is a problem of capital expenditure. Why do I say that? Because in order to make any progress, the first thing we need to do, or priority number one, is to make electricity generation sustainable. Now, there's no point in having electric vehicles if your electricity generation isn't sustainable. There's no point in heating buildings and cooling buildings with electricity unless electricity is sustainable. There's no point in having all of the innovations that exist in, for example, the steel industry, unless we make electricity sustainable. So we have to make our electricity sustainable. That's capital expenditure. We're incredibly lucky because actually the lead time in sustainable energy generation is much shorter than the lead time in conventional, in the likes of nuclear or the likes of coal. Wind and solar can actually be built very, very rapidly. And even the transmission lines, even the grid infrastructure can be built relatively rapidly. So these are, we could make energy across Europe substantially sustainable, by which I mean we should have 80–90% targets within a decade. Now, the interesting question is, what would you expect your return on capital to be? We can pretty much choose the return on capital because the electricity sector is regulated. But let's say we give a very modest return on capital, say a 2% return on capital. Well, what are our borrowing costs? Germany today can borrow at a fixed rate of interest for 10 years of -0.2%, right? What does that mean? That means Germany gets paid, okay? So if it issues a zero coupon bond today, it will get paid by the private sector in 10 years' time. Okay, so hang on a minute. Why on earth isn't Germany saying we will fund using the state's balance sheet? Literally, let's issue 30% of GDP at -0.2 at a negative interest rate, so the private sector will pay me, and I will make a 2% return. That's the private sector currently makes somewhere between a 4 and 6% return on capital in electricity generation assets. Right? This is totally pointless because the state only needs to make a positive return. Now, what does that do to your balance sheet? Well, that creates value because the return on capital is higher than the cost of capital. So what does that do to the state's balance sheet? And this is where we need to have a proper, intelligent, mature conversation about the fact that there are two sides to our balance sheet as a nation. There are liabilities and there are assets. And we are talking about issuing liabilities in order to create assets, and actually to create net assets. So as a society, that would be worth doing regardless of saving the environment and making energy sustainable, because we actually generate a positive net return. Okay, so this is the first point that has to be right at the heart of the fiscal debate. We will actually create assets as a state. We will be wealthier. Germany would be wealthier in 10 years' time if it made its energy sector sustainable. And all it requires is a greater than 0% nominal return on investment for that equation to hold. Okay, so now from a practical standpoint, I actually think we need to segment sustainable energy investment in electricity generation from the rest of the state's balance sheet. So what we should literally say is fiscal rules are too complicated. We have an emergency, which is climate change. We can actually generate, as long as we generate positive returns from our investments as a state, we should issue debt with a state guarantee and segregate the capital. To me, this is absolutely compelling, and it's simple arithmetic that we should do this. The final point then relates to how can this relate to wealth inequality? Well, the irony here is we're creating wealth. So the costs, in fact, of this transition will be borne primarily by the owners of carbon assets, which we are in effect trying to destroy the value of carbon assets. And we should be very clear to the general public. the cost of the green transition is actually on thugocracies, theocracies, and a fraction of the 1%, because those are the people who own the carbon assets. Most of the population doesn't own a carbon asset. We frankly don't actually really care if the oil reserves of the world go from having a market capitalization in the trillions to a market capitalization of 0. That's not a problem. That's a problem for a tiny fraction of the global population. So the reality is we are going to create assets, and we're going to destroy assets that are held by a tiny minority of the global population. So what are we going to do with the ownership of the new assets that we create? Well, it's obvious that we should give them to the people who don't have assets. So in my view, there really are two major challenges here, which are very, very tractable with respect to sustainable investment spending and the green transition. We need to use the state's balance sheet to fund capital investment. We need to dramatically shorten our timelines. We should be way more ambitious. We simply need to make a positive return on capital, which is far lower than existing return on capital within the sector. We should have something like a 10-year timeline, and we should be issuing the debt in segregated accounts in order to fund this. And then when the wealth is created on a 10, 15, 20-year view, we should think about who should own it.
Thanks, Eric. I'm sure there are a lot of thoughts that people have already to that. Please hold them a bit longer. I want to hand over to Ronan to also give his thoughts for like 5 minutes. And yeah, then we close with Anna after that.
Thanks very much. And as with the rest of this great Fiscal Matters week, already we're getting some really good discussion and really good points across. So I'm, as you said, Ronan Palmer, I direct the Clean Economy program at E3G. E3G is a climate think tank, but we particularly look at the political economy and diplomacy of climate change and the net zero transition. So I'm going to give some perspectives on this problem from that angle, if you might. I'm going to start by just reminding us when it comes to the the political economy of climate change, we're talking about a transition of the economy to move it to net zero. I always say that this is not the same as unplugging dirty stuff and plugging in clean stuff. It's a bit more complicated. We're unplugging fuel with positive marginal cost and replacing it with a fuel with very high capital costs, but actually pretty zip, nothing in terms of marginal costs. And I could go on in several other ways thinking about how shifting from fossil fuels is going to change the way we think about currency and exchange rates, the way we have to think about how capital flows, even the way we think about trade flows. 10% of global trade flows are fossil fuel related. Things are going to be different, folks. And while we are making that transition, we're also managing the risks of a changing climate. You may or may not have noticed, but it does seem to be changing all around us. It's no marginal game, this. These are big changes. Now, if we were just going to go to the original challenge and address the serious problems we see with productivity and inequality, and we weren't at the same time trying to make a big non-marginal change in the economy, that would be pretty tough. But now what about when we're trying to transform the economy at the same time while defending it against a changing climate? I would regard that as kind of a problem squared or cubed. I wish we hadn't landed ourselves in this climate problem while having serious inequality problems, serious productivity problems, and a few others besides. And that then brings us into the politics of making this different. So, as Eric has just said, we need some money to spend on this one. It's not cheap. It's very doable. It's well worth it. It's not cheap. And yet, where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves in a rhetoric, at least, of a tight fiscal straitjacket. And as we emerge from the COVID crisis, we're already seeing the The frugal 4 have now doubled to the frugal 8 within the European Union. The straitjacket is coming back, and how real or not it is very real in terms of the discourse and in terms of the politics. Plus, we've had a very strong focus on private finance, and indeed, in many ways, we've got used to governments feeling constrained by the markets. Despite the fact that Germany has made, I had the figure a moment ago, I don't know how much in terms of interest from those people who are willing to borrow at negative interest rates from it. Nevertheless, we know that there is a strong political sense that governments can't move and make big changes constrained by markets all of the time. And I guess the one thing that perhaps we haven't articulated so well, it's very true for those of us who have live or have lived recently in the United Kingdom, but I think it is a much more generic problem. The government as administrator, the government as deliverer, hasn't been practicing, it hasn't been exercising its delivery muscles enough lately. Every time I sat in a debate in the United Kingdom about the role of government, people would say, well, whatever else, the government can't pick winners. And it was just an act of faith. It didn't matter whether you believed it or not, you had to say it. So the politics there have left us in a fairly weak position. Plus, we then know that within this, and this is really obvious to those of us who are working with climate change, the sheer difference between young and old, the sheer difference between urban and rural. So I live in a city in Ireland, but I know that when I go out into the countryside, I'm careful about how I talk about climate change, because to them, it's an attack on their rural way of life. How can they drive into the city? What about all the cattle that I am telling people they should not even be eating? And of course, we know that this depends very much on the willingness of countries to work together. The willingness of countries to work together when we have this huge increase in-country nationalism and a huge sense of, wonderful rhetoric about the whole world coming together around COVID. And you just follow the checkbooks, but the checkbooks are not following the rhetoric, which I find very sad. So that I think is why something like what we're talking about today is just so important. Firstly, we know we're reaching the limits of what we can do with monetary policy. And indeed, I sure many others around this call would agree, the current monetary policy is possibly even exacerbating inequality. We know the increases in inequality that have happened recently due to asset purchases, and reflects again Eric's point about who owns which assets. And we also know that there are productivity impacts from both the policies and the inequalities. We know that we need the fiscal policy to really drive through the changes that we need. And we know that we need to bring the people along with us in terms of climate change and a net zero transition, almost at precisely the time when we also need them to accept the kind of big changes in their lives that may well be needed as a result of transitioning to net zero, but also the very changes that they're going to need as the climate changes around them. So from a purely economic perspective, this is an absolutely crucial trilemma to address. And yet it is precisely because of the importance of the economics that the politics becomes extremely challenging. Thanks very much, Larissa.
Thanks, Ronan. Also another great talk. Anna, could you please share your slides?
So do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I hope you see my slides now. And now in full screen. Okay. So today we're talking about fiscal policy and how it interacts with inequality, productivity, and how can we transition into a greener economy. So let me just present you 3 facts that will go a bit into the direction of what Frank in the beginning told us. So first of all, are you seeing here, is this, okay, maybe now it's better. I think there was a box here covering the slides. Okay, so first, there has been a decoupling, as Frank was saying, between productivity, hourly productivity, and hourly compensation. This is not a phenomenon, exclusive to Europe. We see this also in the US and Japan, and it's even more, the gap is even wider for those regions. But especially over the last years, this has been widening quite a bit for Europe. Then second, once again, and together with this last fact, wage share is increasing. And wage share is basically compensation of our output. And the trend is also negative here for the Euro area, not as negative as for other regions, but it is something that governments should take into account. Then finally, I wanted to talk about a fact on inequality. So inequality shows different patterns across different countries. Here, I talk about income inequality. So I show here in this chart the difference between the income share accrued by the top 10% of the distribution and the income share accrued by the bottom 50, in the distribution. So basically, if we see an upward trend, either this means that the top 10 are getting a larger slice of the cake, and the cake is total income, or the bottom are getting a smaller slice, or both are happening. So, and we see that for some countries, comparing, for example, to the 80s, this has happened. So inequality seems to have increased, not so much in, for example, other countries like Spain. And we also need to take into account, of course, that, well, inequality involves many other effects. These are slowly moving trends that we cannot picture a clear, uniform idea across all countries in Europe. Though this is something we should, of course, keep in mind. And this brings us to the challenge that we are talking today, that is governments. How can governments, and if they can use fiscal policy to boost productivity while trying to reverse these trends that we have just seen, going towards a greener economy, while I would like to say decreasing inequality, but I think if they are not increasing inequality, that would be already good enough. So today I'll present you some work that is out there on these topics, which is actually encouraging and shows that, okay, governments may be able to do these things, but there are a bunch of other things that they should take into account not to make things worse. So first, from my work with some co-authors, we use regional data from Eurozone to study the impact of fiscal policy. And in fact, we find that fiscal policy here, mainly accounting for employee compensation and intermediate consumption of government, can boost economic activity, not only measured by GDP per capita, but also employment in both private and public sector, which can be rationalized by a boost in productivity, both total factor productivity or labor productivity, and also that the labor share here measured as the compensation of employees relative to the gross value added can also increase. However, one thing that we also find is that, of course, this is on average results for the Eurozone, and that there are many things that may matter for these results to materialize. We find, for example, regional heterogeneities. We find sectoral heterogeneities, which are quite substantial and significant. We find as well also, of course, business cycle differences. Well, and of course, there's always something, debt accumulation one needs to take into account. So this is more for discretionary fiscal policy. Now, there's also evidence, for example, from work of Canova and Papa on the European funds that also find a positive impact of these funds. Some more on the short run, others more on the medium run, but they can also have a significant positive economic impact, and at least temporarily have an impact on things like productivity. Now, once again, they also find significant regional heterogeneities that are, of course, posing a risk of polarization, of inequality risk that also goes a bit back to what Ronan was saying on this, rising polarization. And we need cooperation, but we don't. How can this go together with the fiscal policy? So we need to be careful with this. We need to be careful that things like European funds are not actually dividing and creating more inequalities across Europe. And some candidates for these differences are, for example, government inefficiencies, lack of medium-term planning. Maybe countries need more structural changes before, or at least some of them, before starting putting all this money into projects. Maybe there is shortage of entrepreneurship and low education or lower education compared to other countries that are responsible for these differences. And so these are some things that maybe countries can take into account and rethink whether they can address this or not. Now, I wanted just to also bring to the conversation the effort that has been recently put out here by the European Commission, on reduction, on setting clear milestones for the reduction of emissions, the European climate law that was just put in force, setting a huge chunk of their budgets, also for example, from Next Generation EU Recovery Plan to this issue. And just recently making concrete proposals for this transition, as for example, pricing pollution in sectors like aviation and maritime, which is not been done at the moment. Now, of course, we may need more action and faster action, but I think we can discuss this also next. And let me just also finish with a study that I found from Cambridge Econometrics for the European Climate Foundation. And I found it very interesting that they find that decarbonization, for example, of course, these specific sectors, but it's already quite interesting and quite encouraging, I would say, that decarbonization in transport and household heating sectors can have a positive economic impact, especially when you look further in the future. Once again, the one thing common to all these studies is that there are, again, heterogeneities across countries and across economic sectors, across households that one should take into account. And things like, for example, the way that governments do tax recycling from, in this case, emission trading systems will matter and can have significant impact on redistributional effects in the economy, on the way they fuel back their revenues into the economy. And they can do tax cuts, they can do lump sum transfers, they can reinvest again in low carbon technologies. The one thing that this study finds that it's not really or will lead to a worse situation is indeed paying out debt with this revenue. So not reinvesting is a huge mistake. Not reinvesting in the economy, or not giving it back for balancing these heterogeneities, these heterogeneous effects that the policies on climate change will produce. So I just wanted to finish. So maybe Maddie and Honan also want to add more on this climate topic, and maybe they want also to tell me how this goes through other sectors of the economy, if there are similar studies or not out there. And I just wanted to finish saying that I think this is actually a great opportunity for countries to to rethink their economies and to replan their economies into the direction of climate, you know, a neutral, climate neutral economy, and that, of course, I would say that the major issue here in play will be inequality, not only within countries, but also across countries in Europe, which can then, of course, create political tensions, going back again to what Ronan was saying. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Another great talk. I saw there were already some questions in the Q&A, so please, please keep them coming. We're gonna essentially pick them. I mean, you can also vote them up. So if there are more likes, for example, on a question, we are more likely to read it out loud and to answer it in the panel. So feel free to post it, feel free to like it, and we'll pick it up accordingly. Yeah, thanks again very much to all of you, to all the panelists. We've heard a lot of stuff from systems-based thinking, from system thinking, to financial flows, to asset ownership, to the resilience that we need to create or maintain in some way, to the positive aspects of the fiscal policies, and also to the heterogeneity issues that can arise and are quite important actually to take into account. And before I go to the questions that we have in the Q&A, it's just I want to probably ask one question on that heterogeneity issue. So what is the role of government really? So Ronan already said they haven't really, the government hasn't really used its potential fully yet. So what do we need to do in some way? Do we need to give more power to regional governments, for example? Would that be an option? Or what is a way out? I just want to pose that question very openly to the panel. Whoever wants to pop in first, you're very welcome.
So
yes.
Could I? So it reflects a little on some work that we have done on innovation, particularly, and innovation as a driver of productivity. And the simple fact is, innovation money tends to go to countries that are already productive, and we have the excellence principle that the European Commission has been using in moving its innovation funding around tends to push innovation to the excellent. And guess where the excellent are? They're where there's already lots of capacity. And yet, arguably, the places where you could make some really big productive changes are moving to countries that are not quite at the heart of this. And we've been looking at the scope for what I would describe coming as I do from a small European state. I kind of don't mind saying the periphery or the smaller states. You know, we're not as big as the Germanys and the Frances and the Italys, but we do, you know, we still have economies and people. And there are huge gains to be made for some of the smaller states in terms of moving ahead quickly on something like net zero. And I say net zero not because I think net zero necessarily would be the ultimate way of improving productivity, but because we know we have to go to net zero. Therefore, if you have to go to net zero, go quickly, get the productivity gains early on that are available, and help change the flows of supply chains, help move more money to some of the regions that are not quite so powerful or not quite so rich as they might be at the moment. And that's where, something like Anna Maria's research really helps, because it really does show this differential that we have. And it shows that much of the policy that we have been using has tended not to flow in those directions. That's why it's so lovely to see it.
Any other thoughts on it from the other panelists?
Yes, probably I can go next. So I agree that the government has not used entirely its power, and especially in order to deal with the climate crisis, not only the climate crisis, and the social crisis as well. So what I said in my talk is that we need to have different targets. We need to According to my view, we need to target inequality, environmental sustainability, including taking into account labor productivity as well. So given that the government needs to play an important role in order to have this transition to a more environmentally friendly, let's say, economy. But at the same time, if we want to look into the regional issues, we need to have a kind of industrial policy in which the government tries to understand the sectors in which could invest more in order to have more economic activity, and at the same time use all this high economic activity in a sustainable way. And so my suggestion would be not only to use the government, and the government needs to play a key role in order to achieve this type of transition, but other policies need to be used as well. Not only industrial policy, monetary policy needs to be used in the same direction. And I said at the end of my presentation something about changing the consumption patterns. So this should go along, otherwise we will not be able to deal with all this complexity. Thanks.
Teresa, maybe I could just add something quickly in terms of the role of the government, because I think the role of the government is, and fiscal policy is absolutely huge. And the way I'm trying to present the problem is that I think the challenge can be explained pretty quickly, and simply, but implementation is quite complex, is a little bit complicated. The challenge is that the state's cost to capital, I mean, Ronan, I think, is referring to Ireland. If you look at Ireland, I just checked Irish government bond yields. Irish government bond yields are 0.3% for 10 years. That's a fixed rate of interest, right? So people have to be really clear about this, because a lot of people are saying, well, what if interest rates rise? That's a fixed rate of interest. There's a very simple, obvious question. Why isn't the Irish government issuing 30, 40% of GDP right now, segmenting it into a standalone fund and saying, we are going to fund a boom, a phenomenally high growth in sustainable electricity generation in the Irish economy? We can invest both debt and equity, and all we have to do is make a positive return. And in 10 years' time, we will have created wealth, right? We will be richer. This is really important. So I actually don't like framing this in terms of saying it's costly. It's actually not costly. I mean, because human beings, we don't think of costs in terms of opportunity costs, right? This is a kind of semantic point about where you could have done other investment. There is opportunity cost. That's not what human beings mean by cost. When you say to the population, it's going to cost you a huge amount of money, people think, oh my God, it's going to cost me money. This hasn't cost you anything. You've made money, right? This is like a buy-to-let where you had a 0 interest rate mortgage and you had a rental yield of 4%. That didn't cost you anything, right? You ended up making, in a decade's time, 40%, okay? That's a huge return. And so we have to change the narrative completely. We are wasting an investment opportunity that happens to have also the consequence of making our system sustainable, right? So that is that actual problem of capital expenditure. Okay, so the question then becomes a purely practical one. How do I get the Irish government to use effectively a 0 cost to capital to fund a positive return on capital, which is a question of governance? And Ireland is actually a good case to look at, because governance, the track record is extremely poor. Right? So, and we should be blunt about this, absolutely. So what we should be focused on is, how do we run regulated electricity to generate a modest positive return, highly ambitious investment timelines, and completely transparent and good governance? That's the challenge for people like us, for the policy arena, and for the public NGOs to be pressuring our governments. This is not just doable. These timelines are totally reasonable. They will create good economic growth, improvements in productivity, because it's capital expenditure and technological progress, and we will be wealthier. Right? So at the moment, we are squandering a positive sum opportunity.
Thanks, Eric. I think that was a really great, kickoff of the discussion, and there are some questions in the Q&A already coming in, so maybe we can turn to these. I wanted to read out one in particular for you, Eric. That's from Thomas. Yeah, he says, thanks a lot for the great discussion. And the question he asks is, Eric, could you please develop on the assertion that fiscal rules follow the economic reality rather than they determine them? It's a bit unclear what that means. So maybe just to clarify a bit on that, and then we can go on.
Sure, I would just make a very simple empirical observation. If I showed you the debt GDP ratio of all the developed countries in the world over the last 20 years, and I asked you to pick out, without naming them, and I asked you to pick out the countries that had a fiscal rule and the countries that don't have a fiscal rule, you would not be able to identify them. And the trends have broadly been the same. So in other words, all I'm really saying is that if we stand back and take some perspective on the evolution of public sector debt, it seems to be determined by other factors. Now, there are some extreme exceptions to that. So if you have, and the Eurozone is relevant, because the Eurozone has actually made the fiscal rule more important than it should be. And the reason for that is because in the Eurozone, eligibility for QE depends on fiscal compliance. So that creates this very knife-edge political situation where if the Italian government, for example, becomes populist and says we reject the fiscal rule, immediately spreads widen because they're no longer, effectively they're threatening QE eligibility. So there is a particular nuance with respect to the Eurozone, which I would grant, and I think that's very bad institutional design, by the way, but it is what it is. But if you take if you broadly took Eurozone as a single entity and looked at all other developed countries, the United States doesn't have any fiscal rule, but its fiscal path has followed pretty much that of countries like the United Kingdom that have tried to implement fiscal rules as well. So really all I'm saying is the most important determinant of fiscal outcomes is actually growth and interest rates.
Thanks. I hope that has clarified the question. If not, just pose more questions, please. So coming back to the discussion that we just had. So when we say we will make money rather than it will cost us money, Eric, I guess again, do you mean there will be a net transfer of money from the private to the public sector, or is there any particular meaning with "we" in that statement that you want to clarify on?
I mean, in some sense, yes, because I get it. But the really important point to bear in mind here, so you know, in my professional capacity as an investor, we make investments in sustainable electricity generation. The private sector, typically within Europe and across the developed world, requires a return on equity of something like 4 to 6%. So we are making 4 to 6% returns. Now, bear in mind, that is way, way higher than the state's cost of capital is the first point that's critically important. But there are also huge externalities. So this is a way too high. It's a suboptimal level of return relative to the collective benefits. So what the state needs to do is effectively de-risk electricity completely and collapse return requirements and increase investment spending. And we're talking about a regulated utilities where we can effectively put floors under the electricity price and put caps to the consumer. We can completely de-risk them. And we can give very aggressive timelines. So you sit down with the private sector and you say, okay, we're going to actually guarantee the debt. We're going to dramatically reduce electricity price risk as a state, because we can do that. It's a regulated utility. We're going to use our balance sheet to both provide equity and debt. And then can you make the investment that we need? Can you get us to 80% sustainable energy within a decade? Electricity, right? That's the kind of policy framework that we're, now that doesn't cost us anything because our cost of borrowing today, it is the private sector in Europe for whatever reason is paying the German government you know, everybody's got a negative real interest rate after inflation, even using 2% inflation, not current inflation, right? So everybody's state cost of capital is negative in real terms. So the private sector, for whatever reason, is paying the state to issue debt. And we can generate a modest positive return on our capital expenditure. So that's just positive returning investment. technically, we could also reduce electricity prices. I mean, this is the irony. I mean, we could target literally break even if we wanted to. If we wanted to, we could say, let's also have a trend. I think we should have at least stable nominal electricity prices as a target, but we could actually target a decline in the electricity price at the same time. So, you know, but the important point is this is completely tractable. Right. We're incredibly fortunate. We have a major challenge that requires investment spending, and we have a historic low in cost of capital as a state. So this is both a failure just of organization and the mind.
Thanks, Eric. Anyone else? Yeah, Ronan, please.
So just to simultaneously agree and disagree with Eric, if I might be so Schrödingerish about it, I totally agree. I think the maths and the economics add up that way, but life is path dependent. So why doesn't the Irish government invest, as you say? Because actually it's got a housing crisis. If it attempted to invest in renewable assets, it would be out of power in the morning. I apologize for the pun. It would be out of government in the morning. It would be up to its neck in power. And this is why I say it's the coming together of crises, including the other crisis that you kind of allude to, which is almost like a crisis of confidence in government. Supposing now that I did actually persuade the Irish government that it could simultaneously invest in renewable generation and better housing and lock itself into a 10-year rate, I know I would be then in the Department of Finance talking to people saying, but you have no idea what happens next. You have no idea if they're going to get us somewhere else. You have no idea if Apple, and I live in a city surrounded by Apple and by high-tech pharma and medical devices, and they're all going to disappear, and those are things that give us jobs. And I wouldn't actually have an answer for them, because I genuinely don't know how capital moves any longer. I used to know. I used to be real good at this stuff, but unfortunately the economy just got too complicated for me. So there is a real doubt in this, and that's why I say I think the political coalitions really, really matter. Yes, we need to show them the economics behind all of this, but actually getting it across the political line remains a real challenge.
Maybe I can also ask a question to Eric. Though I'm not watching, but I'm also interested to follow up on this issue. So, okay, for the UK and maybe Ireland, this would work. Would this work for other countries? Do you have any say on this? And then second, could you also go back to your point on who will own the capital? Because I was also interested to hear your thought on that, because I think that's quite, debatable, and can be quite not nice, I would say, to hear for many people how you would decide on that. So if you could elaborate on that, I would be happy, because I'm learning a lot also.
Yeah, Eric, do you just want to go?
Yeah, I think the observation, first of all, in terms of which geographies it's relevant to, it's relevant to the entire developed world, at least. I think it's relevant to the developed world, and it's relevant to China. So I would say, as a matter of economic reality, the developed world and China are not financially constrained. And what I mean by that is the return on capital is higher than the cost of capital, which means it's self-funding. Yeah. So again, if it doesn't have to be Ireland, it could be France, it could be Germany. Look at Japan. Japan has got zero interest rates out for 30 years, right? So all you need, it's a really simple observation.
I meant more like, for example, Southern European countries.
Well, Southern Europe,
or others that have, other types of troubles that can
Sure.
risk a bit this idea that it can go also well.
Yeah, I mean, the
or
problem,
not, I don't know.
No,
you'll tell me.
Well, I agree. There is a problem specific to the Eurozone, which is about, so to answer Ronan's point, if you, in bond markets are interest rate expectations, right? So there is the strongest correlation across the world. If you want to know where a 10-year government bond yield is, look at where the overnight interest rate is, right? So look at where official interest rates are. So, you know, why are Brazilian interest rates 6% is because of where short-term interest rates are. So they're interest rate expectations. Obviously, there's also a yield curve, but where short-term interest rates are is predominantly the determinant. This is why we haven't had any of these bond crises, despite the fact that we've just issued 30% of GDP or 40% of GDP, because look at where nominal interest rates are. And that's more important than quantitative easing, which confuses everybody, because you can't, if you compare the countries that haven't done quantitative easing, it still holds. Southern Europe is a very specific issue, because during the Euro crisis, we saw this kind of independent behavior of the cost of debt because of a fear of default. So I can entirely understand, if I was sitting down with Mario Draghi, he'd go, you know, there's a risk here, because the only point there is that risk is there anyway, because the reality is there is absolutely no circumstance I can see where Italy is ever going to meet fiscal rules. I mean, Italy's debt to GDP ratio is just way too high. It is not coming down. So I just don't know. And that's why I would almost rather, as a matter of policy, that the Eurozone and the Commission decides to say, let's put this off balance sheet. So have a segregated account, essentially, where you issue debt for capital expenditure to do with sustainable electricity generation. Because on current BTP yields, if I look at the current yield on Italian debt, which I think is about 1% over 10 years, definitively Italy should be able to invest in electricity generating assets with a higher return than 1%. Right? I mean, if the private sector is currently generating a 6% return, you could lend to the private sector and reduce its cost of capital and get more investment spending. The final point then is who's going to own the assets. Well, I think you have an interest. Look at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is analogous. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, people say this was because it had oil revenues. That's not entirely true. It did seed it. It did initially invest with oil revenues, but 2/3 of its value are its return. That's fascinating. Like 2 times Norwegian GDP is due to the compound return. So for example, if they'd issued debt to fund the Sovereign Wealth Fund, they would now have net, they could repay the debt and they would have 100% of GDP in assets. That's what I'm describing. So what I'm saying here is that why aren't we doing this? We're not just destroying our environment, we're also not making a return on capital and reaping the benefits. And that is true across every geography. With these real cost of capital, all we need to do is generate a positive rate of real return. And then we will have a very nice problem in 15 years' time, which is we will have created something like 30-40% of GDP of assets, and which effectively the state will be the owner of. We could distribute ownership of those assets to people who don't have assets. If we want to tackle wealth inequality.
And why, in your opinion, haven't they done it? Yeah, okay. But why haven't they done it so then? Do you have any theory on this? Or well, I mean, sure.
First
it
of all,
goes
I think
a bit back to what Ronan was saying, maybe on the political side of the question, but right?
But it's partly
I
politics.
totally didn't get.
I think it's partly politics, but it's not just politics, because if I've just finished reading, Bill Gates's book, I've reread Stern's book, I've reread Mark Jacquard's book, right? All of these are great books on the climate crisis. Nowhere do any of them mention the state's cost of capital. It is the most important variable. If my problem is investment spending, the most important variable is my cost of capital. And yet, if you read Stern, as the leading economist, doesn't mention it. Right? Even read Dieter Helm's. I've just finished reading Dieter Helm's book. Now, I want to make clear, these are all fantastic books. Yeah, they're great books. But I go straight to the appendix. I see, where's the cost? Where does it say that it will cost you nothing, you will make money?
But do you think it's maybe the perception then of people, like of people who choose the governments, like of you know, people who are out there, and they will think, okay, where this money, how is this money going to be paid? Because that's the first, I think, the first idea that every taxpayer has when governments start borrowing money or making big investments is like, am I going to pay this tomorrow, or are we going to be back in a similar situation as we were, you know, not long ago? Do you think this plays any role as well, or?
I think it's significantly, I think Ronan's point is really important, which is there is huge distrust in the capacity of the state. I do want to make clear, though, I'm not saying that we nationalize these industries. I'm not saying the state, I'm saying the state should finance it. And I think there's a legitimate challenge in terms of governance. I think the Recovery Act, actually, the Americans did some very interesting innovation in governance. So I think we should be working on governance. We need to agree a plan and then say, okay, governance. For example, if when I talk to Irish politicians about this, or indeed Irish civil society organizations, they immediately say, but look at NAMA, which was effectively the asset resolution trust set up after the financial crisis. It was hijacked by the political class and vested interests. So in clientelist, in dysfunctional public sphere, this is problematic, because what will happen is vested interests hijack it, they take a lower cost of capital, they make money from it, they give it to their pals, and we don't get the investment spending. That would be a disaster, okay? But we have to be clear the nature of our problem, right? Does this mean we all have to change our behavior and sacrifice a huge amount? Or is this a problem of public sector governance and use of the balance sheet? Let's just be clear on the nature of the problem. And I think this is a governance challenge, but I also think there's a huge failure of the mind, because every conversation I listen to on transforming and shift to net zero, how frequently do you hear the state's cost of capital mentioned?
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. And I think Maria has something to say as well in that respect. Please. Yes,
no worries about that. So I have 2 points just to add. And when we talk about the public spending, I think it makes sense to, as Eric said, just distinguish about different group of countries. So when we talk about this type of policies of increasing public debt and so on, obviously we refer to developed countries. So other countries, developed countries, they have a subordinate position. So obviously they don't have the same access to capital markets. So you have investors that very willingly just are going to withdraw their money. So when we focus on developed countries, I always have in my mind like the UK, and that you have a central bank, the Bank of England, that always support any type of government spending that the government does. So then my next question is like, okay, we have this Euro area and we have the ECB and we have the central bank. So obviously the ECB can deal with the risks that we might have because of increasing debt to GDP. And when we talk about risk, I have in my mind interest rate risks and exchange rate risks. So these are some risks that the Bank of England has dealt with in case there are some problems. What about the ECB? Why don't they do that? Probably they have done it, but they have done it for some countries. So what I'm saying is, and I totally agree with that, with Eric and Ronald said about that, it's a political economy issue. It's about an issue of moral hazard. So when someone just doesn't play the game along the line, like Greece and other southern countries, you don't want to support them because it's like a bad example for the other ones. Otherwise, the ECB could just say that we could support these government bonds, their government bonds in the capital markets, and probably we would have avoided some of the problems back then. So that was the one point. And then the other point, and I know that we have many questions, but probably we can discuss a little bit what Eric suggested about this government spending. And there is a lot of discussion of excluding some expenditures that are linked, let's say, with climate from the debt to GDP. And probably some others I would like to hear your view as well. So do you think that it's a good idea in order to exclude, let's say, green spending from debt to GDP ratio, and as a result, and this is what Eric said, does it make sense? For me, it would be a very nice idea, but I'm not sure that it would be the best solution for the problem. First of all, because we still focus on the debt to GDP, or the government debt to GDP, so it is within the existing current framework. And then I'm thinking, what about other types of expenditure? What about social expenditure? Should we exclude these as well? So I'm thinking a little bit about this, guys, and I was wondering whether other panelists would like to share their view. Thanks.
Are there any views on that issue? Anna?
I think I in some sense I agree. I think these are, important questions. But as Maria was saying, if we exclude climate investment on climate, like government spending on climate issues from our accountability measures, well, are we hiding the problem behind are we just hiding or shooting down the can down the road, or is there another way? Maybe first governments could think on how to, like, on possible ways not to increase so much debt. How can they, for example, as I mentioned, this type of schemes with the emissions, the trading schemes, whether they can, refuel back, put back the money into the economy and trying to address these issues. Because then if we are, excluding climate change issues, then, okay, what about the social issues? Those are huge in some countries as well. And they are, of course, I would not say more important, but they are really important in some countries. So we cannot do this for every important issue, I think. Though maybe, for example, for countries in the Eurozone or within the Euro area or European Union, there can be other mechanisms helping out countries cope with this issue. Now we have these huge packages with Next Generation EU. I hope countries will take this chance and put the money to work in a optimal way. I think we'll see the outcome in some years or in some months now. But on the one side, I see that this would be a good solution to incentivize countries to look into this issue and to start acting now. On the other side, maybe this has to come more from a supranational dimension and come from agreement across countries, because also I think, though I totally understand Eric's argument, it makes perfect sense that countries could do it on their own, and they could start, they could start acting now. There's not apparently for them much incentive to do so. They are always waiting on the others. And yesterday at ECB Forum, I was actually hearing the discussion of the governors, and the governor of Bank of England was actually saying, okay, we are really looking for Glasgow in November, but we hope that emerging economies are also, starting to do something and not just hang around and wait for, Europe to get neutral on these issues, and then the world is a mess in other places. So I think Europe has to act as like its own. I'm not sure it has to wait for emerging economies, but I think it would help countries to step forward and to start acting.
Thanks, Anna. I think that ties really nicely into a bit of the question that Caroline has been asking a little while ago already. And she asks, is the fear of the frugal 4 or 8 by now already? Is that a legitimate fear in terms of them fearing about losing the credit ratings, and what role has for example, the European Central Bank to play in sort of stabilizing the relationship? Maria, for example, do you want to jump in on that, or anyone else?
Yeah, I guess probably Ronan would like to go first because the question was addressed to him. I'm happy to go next.
I wish I knew. I mean, it does come back to the point that Eric is making, that we are probably all overstating the fear that the frugal 4+4, as I will call them for now, express on this. And my suspicion is that different countries' objections to raising debt probably come from different places. And therefore it's not, you know, the countries are different. It's not like there's necessarily a simple solution to this. But whatever it is, the fear is very real. Some of the new members of the now Frugal 8, particularly if I remember Slovakia, the Czech Republic, they have all actually been through pretty painful restructurings post, the post 2008, 2011, 12. Just as Ireland was, and just as Greece was. So you know, a lot of countries have actually been through this process. So there is almost like a kind of a European post-traumatic thing about this. So I think there's going to be some time before we actually get a fuller theory that will enable people to move forward. But I suspect the other the other thing that may be holding people back is the fact that we still would have to address the productivity challenges. We still have to address the inequality challenges. And which then brings me to my concern that there are ways that we could take the European Union into a glorious net zero future that might have had no carbon, but it mightn't have much equality, and it mightn't have much productivity either. So this is why I really hope we can bring things together at European Union level so that we move to net zero, but we ensure that the energy, the asset, and perhaps this is going back to some of what Eric's saying about asset ownership and that, the benefits of this transition are genuinely shared out. Particularly bearing in mind that we are moving from places where you have lots and lots of miners digging out coal and all of them getting a very nice salary, to you stick up a wind turbine and that's essentially it just moves around. So you are talking about a very different industrial system for quite a lot of areas. So I think that's why I come back to what is it that's actually driving these ministers of finance? And by the way, Olivier Boudin in the chat also pointed out that they're probably very driven by GDP, not economic returns. Ruin life, Olivier is nearly always right. I think he's definitely right on this occasion. So, you know, what's driving these people may not be right. How do we make some changes in what's driving them?
Maria, yes.
Yes, totally agree with the points that Ronan made. And obviously it's a political economy question. So when we have all these countries, the frugal 4 or 8, having a specific view on fiscal policy, it's problematic. So since there are these fears about the credit ratings, obviously they are going to push other countries to have a similar opinion in order to restrict the government debt to GDP. But then how do we change this type of rhetorics? Probably because we need to change democracy, but in order to change them, probably we need a kind of a different story. So I think this story about the ecological crisis that we are now facing could be another alternative. So as Ronan said, we need to have this decarbonization of the economy. How are we going to achieve it if we're not going to have the government play an important role? And I agree, we don't need to industrialize to make them state-owned companies. We just need to support them effectively. But before supporting them, first we need to choose which of these sectors are important or not. So, and this is one point that Ronan made in his presentation. So when we have this transition, doesn't mean that it is easily done. You cannot just exclude companies that are carbon intensive and just support the other ones that are green. There is a transition. And in order to do that, we need a government to have a kind of a design in order to implement these changes and have less transition effect. And I mean about jobs, people losing their jobs when they work at a coal company and carbon intensive companies as well, in order to be able later on gradually to find a job in the other green sector.
Thanks, Maria. There was a related question that Ron, you had to, or you marked as you wanted to answer it live in the conversation. It's from Mick. Regarding the nexus of crisis, and if you can think of any policies that can address more than one at once. Do you want to still answer that question quickly?
Well, I think this goes back to the Cambridge econometrics work that's already been referred to. I think was you, Maria, that refer to it, and it shows that that we can get far greater gains from something that not just shifts from policies like renovation wave in the European Union. It really could make a difference. It would improve people's housing. It would reduce their energy needs. It could be, if it were done at the same time as, for instance, ensuring that those renovated homes were properly connected to decent broadband, etc. Or if you did not just renovated the homes, but also seriously thought about the design of the cities around them, so urban trees and urban greenery, you could make huge improvements to people's lives, huge steps forward to net zero, and potentially by giving people kind of better places to live and better life experience around them, make a substantial difference to productivity and to the attractiveness of different parts of the Union. So I really do think that that's, in response to Meg and other people who've put that same question to me, thinking through that would be really, really important. Which is why I particularly welcome that paper, but I'd welcome others' views on what he's asking.
Thanks, Ronan. I just wanted to ask another question. It seems like the whole reorganization of what a good life is in some way, and there are some debates around whether actually productivity growth is really that good, and also in the wake of the climate crisis, obviously, constantly growing the economy has been shown to not necessarily have the most positive effects in terms of battling or combating climate change. Maybe Sophia or anyone else in the panel wants to take that question. So can we actually constantly grow and achieve the transition at the same time successfully?
I actually don't know a lot of research on that topic, but on the top of my mind, I would say that if we grow on the sectors that are less polluting, then maybe we can keep growing. Of course, I would say to transition to a green economy, there are certain sectors that for sure are going to be, lagged behind and are going to not only be left behind, but people that work there, we talked about it, will have to find new jobs, will have to readjust. But I think this can be put together with productivity in cleaner sectors. But maybe Maria knows more about this issue and can add also a little bit.
Yes, Maria, please.
Yes, I totally agree. First of all, that this is a topic that we need to discuss. So when we talk about climate change and about various policies, there are also regulations or changing consumption patterns that could be done in order to reduce economic activity and help this transition and climate crisis. So what I wanted to say is, when we talk about the growing economy, I always have in my mind the different components of GDP. So I never have in my mind that government spending should go down, especially green spending, social spending, because this is necessary in order to have this transformation of the economy to a low carbon economy. So the second point is, what about investment? Should we reduce investment as well? This is linked with profitability. If we do so, probably firms are going to collapse. So then when I talk about the growing economy, I always have in my mind consumption. So we need to change the way that we consume, our consumption patterns. So in this, I would be able to do something like
would
that.
This, sorry, just to ask one question on what you just said. Would this imply less consumption from your point of view, or just a different consumption?
Both are included, and it depends on how you can achieve it. So the government could have different types of regulations in order to stop people buying specific goods, or you might realize that, for example, instead of using your car, you will be able to use the bus, the electric bus, or the train. But obviously, in order to have this type of a transition, you need the government to step in and provide this infrastructure. So you cannot ask me to stop using my car. I don't have a car, by the way, and use the train if the train is not suitable for me. So the government needs to step in. So this is overall my view about the declining economy, but on top of it, it's linked with labor productivity. So I think this is something that we need to discuss more, because when we talk about increasing labor productivity, and at the same time, we have an increase we have more bargaining power from workers, it might mean higher wages. These wages could be consumed, so people can use their higher wages in order to consume goods. So it goes back and increase more economic activity, so we'll have more CO2 emissions, so more problems. So what I'm saying is, and this is why I said in my presentation that we want this system-based approach in order to analyze all of these issues. Otherwise, other problems might be created. It's not bad. It means that we might need other policies in order to deal with other issues. And Frank has already in the chat book something about coordination. So I will be totally in favor of something like that. Fiscal, monetary coordination, and taking into account regulation that could be implemented.
Thanks.
Maybe I can also add one extra question on this, because what I always think on when we want to change consumption, and I totally agree, there are some things that we totally need to change, as for example, using a car every day, a single person. Maybe you have other cleaner alternatives that you'll find much better after a while. But how can this go also with the political side on this issue? How can governments do this without imposing? You know, how can we separate this helping consumers make a good choice and not falling into a dictatorship? I find it sometimes a bit hard to understand. Also, for me, for example, where I come from Portugal, and we now actually have one party that is more environmental and more fighting for this in the parliament. And there's always this question of imposing also choices on individuals that some people find it, you know, hard to understand, or may lead them to think, okay, now I don't have my freedom anymore. Something gets changed in the political setup in my country or in Europe that I don't agree with the system anymore. And so this is, I think, we need to be careful with this. I totally agree. We need to give the incentives and give the incentives to transition, maybe make these other options cheaper and more available. For example, if we have free public transports, then I will not have the incentive to spend money on a car. Or if an electric car gets, you know, a small allowance when you buy it, maybe, okay, I'm willing to spend a bit more and to buy that option instead of the more pollutant one. But obligating people to make the choice, I'm always a bit like concerned on how we can make this transition without, you know, setting this and without the risk of people thinking we are going into dictatorship or anything.
Yeah, I agree with you that the risk is very much relational when it comes to the transition. Eric, you wanted to chip in on that as well.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. If you look at, and I think this also goes to what Ronan was talking about in terms of, how people in his community view climate change. I think we have to change people's perception of what it means for their lives. If the population starts to think that making the economy sustainable is in their interests and will make them better off, not just with cleaner air, but actually will increase their real disposable income, that will have a dramatic impact both on behavior and on political perceptions. And I think if you look empirically at what Anna's described, all of the success stories in changing behavior and in investment spending have actually been driven not by punitive taxes, but actually by incentives, right? So if you look what's happened with solar panel, it was huge incentives, both through interest rates, as I've suggested we could do with more generally with electricity generation, but also in terms of subsidies. We've seen the same in wind. If you look at Scandinavia now, where, in some countries in December, 95% of auto sales were electric vehicles. Why? For a really simple reason. When you go into the VW dealership, you can buy a car at a 20% discount, which is electric versus combustion. So the point is that it is really simple. If you want people to change what food they eat, you have to make it 20 or 30% cheaper. And I actually think we should literally go sector by sector and say green steel. Green steel should be on the market 30% cheaper than carbon produced steel. And we actually need to have this absolutely as the policy motivation. Because if you contrast that with, say, for example, the most widespread carbon taxes, if you look at the history of carbon taxation, we used it to raise revenue. It's precisely because it's price inelastic, right? If there's no substitute, you both don't change behavior, and all you actually do is typically the cost is going to fall on the people with the lowest levels of income. So I think this is an incredibly important means to change both behavior, but also to change and win the political debate. Now, it is true that if all you do is
but will the incentives make us change fast enough as well? I think
they have to be extreme, right? So let me tell you read Bill Gates's book and you get to the end of it and he goes, it's like an afterthought. What should you do? And he says, you should try one of these Impossible burgers, which are a plant-based burger, when you go into Burger King. Okay, I started going into Burger King and I look at the price. Right? Why isn't it 30 or 40% cheaper? Because if it was 30 or 40% cheaper, and I've got 3 children to feed, I might go and try it. Okay, so if you make the incentive, why have you got there are jurisdictions where we have virtually no electric vehicles and jurisdictions where we have 95% electric vehicle sales. Why? Because if you make the incentives big enough, people will absolutely change their behavior. There is a caveat, which is if all you do is create incentives, you're going to lose tax revenue. Now, I think the tactical strategy here is to treat the consolidated budget independently of green policies. I would not try and make every policy balanced. I think that's crazy. It's bad politics and it's bad economics. We don't know what's going to happen to growth. We don't know what's going to happen to interest rates. We might have to tighten fiscal policy, but if we have to tighten fiscal policy, let's decide what the objectives of fiscal policy are. Okay? We don't do it via green taxes. That seems crazy to me. Do it independently, and we might want to have a wealth tax or a transactions tax, or we might decide that, whatever, we're going to change corporate tax rates. But I think in a sense, we need, as a kind of political objective and also as policy economists, we should completely segregate the issue of what we should do in terms of tax raising from the issue of how to make the economy sustainable. Because if you tell the population sustainable economics equals high taxes, you've just created a huge barrier.
Thanks, Eric. Very great and a very important point. We're already sort of running out of time, so I would really like for everyone to sort of have a very short, ending statement, and if you could all maybe give an answer to the question of how can we ensure a just and green transition? How can we best ensure that? So we can start with Maria again, if you want to start.
Yes, before having the statement, I just probably it's a bit linked with one of the questions that Olga made, and we have talked a little bit about these different sectors and which sectors we choose, and Olga says about these state-led international industrialization policies. And obviously, these policies have been implemented in developing countries for many decades here. In some cases, they had very positive effects. So I would be in favor of taking a look at developing countries like the infant industry argument, which you can first select the industry that we think has an important role, let's say for the green transition, and then invest on this type of company, protect it at the same time in order to not have, let's say, other companies from other countries producing these goods in the same time. So some of them have restrictions on imports in order to protect and build gradually these companies in European, let's say, countries. So I would be in favor of having a kind of a state-led industrialization policy by taking into account what has been done in developing countries as well. But of course, we need to adjust it. And when we talk about the transition to a low carbon economy, and we need to understand that we need fiscal policy in order to achieve this transition. Without fiscal policy, we cannot achieve that. But I'm more in favor of a kind of coordinated policies, not only about the government's monetary policy, by using a kind of quantitative easing. The collateral framework could be adjusted as well. I also talk about industrial policies and also regulation. So I think otherwise, if we don't implement all of these type of policy and regulation, we will not be able to decarbonize that economy.
Thanks, Maria. Eric, do you want to give your final thoughts on that too, please?
Sure, and maybe I'll try and answer Frank's question. Frank asked the question I see here of, if it's so important that our interest rates are lower than our growth rate, is there a problem if a sustainable economy has a lower growth rate? What I would say is that the objective of policy is really clear, which is we have to collapse emissions. Right? That's our priority. So in a sense, my view on the whole growth debate is, let's see what happens to growth, right? I don't see any point in preempting it. And we know how to make our economy, we know how to collapse emissions, which is we have to get electricity generation sustainable, as close to 100%. We have to get everything powered through electricity, and we have to make energy consumption much more efficient. Those are the goals. Those are problems primarily of capital expenditure. Okay. Now, the important point to remember here is that capital expenditure generates a positive return, both an actual positive return. Forget about the externality. Even putting the externality to one side, it generates a positive return unless it's grotesquely incompetent, right? We should be able to generate a positive return on capital. We happen to be the luckiest generation in recorded history because government bond yields at fixed rates of interest in real terms are negative everywhere across the developed world, fixed at negative real interest rates. That is the lowest in recorded history. And we have a capex problem. So the solution is one of, the first one is a problem of the mind. We have to change our mindsets. Then we need to get good governance. And then we need to start putting pressure on our system to generate and create sustainable wealth, which is what we're talking about.
Thanks, Eric. Ronan?
So picking up from that, and somebody in the chat, I think it was Olga, that referred to the black box of governance, and I do realize that there is also a slight black box around political economy. Your economist who's stuck for an answer always turns around and says, "Well, it's all in the politics, And I think the build I would have on what Eric is saying, and I think it is really important to this inequality, productivity, and green future, green growth, however you want to describe it, is that how can we put together some kind of credible, politically credible, I would describe them as platforms, though I appreciate that might have a kind of fossil fuel, oil field terminology to it, but some kind of platform that would bring together local communities, investors, investment plans, and some kind of credible into the future continuity of this. If we can borrow at fixed rates for 10 years, let's give people certainty over 10 years, because people also educate themselves over 10 years. They change their minds about how they want to live their lives over 10 years or whatever. So actually think about this as like a total investment package in the physical capital that's needed, but also the human and social capital that is needed, and make it very real to people. And that way we address what I think of as being kind of, if you like, the culture front of climate change, because there is also, we need to bring the people with us.
Thanks a lot, Ronan. Anna, last but not least.
What can I say after all we discussed? Maybe I can just reinforce the idea that, despite Eric not wanting to know what happens to growth, well, fiscal policy can have an impact on growth, though, with enormous heterogeneous effects across countries. And I have also shown you the study that Cambridge Econometrics can, possibly these green policies can have, a positive economic output. So let's not lose hope. Maybe we need also a bit more research on other policies. So this is specific for transport and heating, household heating sectors. But maybe we need to study other sectors. We need to study the impact of this green transition across different sectors of the economy, and to understand how differently we are going to affect, different countries, different households, different sectors of the economy, because then I think governments are, better prepared to put the tools in place and to start working. Though I have to also say that I have not lost hope. European Commission has also put out a great plan over the last month for and setting up a goal that we want to be the first neutral continent. And I have to be honest, this time I have hope and I believe her. And even the ECB has put it on its strategy review that climate change is now also on their plan, it's on their agenda. So we have also to have hope, I think, in our institutions. And I certainly do. I hope this time will be different, and that we can, put this together, not forgetting all these different, all these heterogeneous impacts across the economy, and still looking after the lower income households and the most affected sectors and people.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anna. I think we're at the end of this panel, and that was a very, very nice ending and a very worthy ending. Thank you to all the panelists, Maria, Eric, Ronan, and Anna. Really great discussion, and thank you to Frank. Maybe you want to turn on your video as well.
Thank you for putting out and for a great moderation as well.
Thanks, Frank, for organizing this.
Yeah, great work, Teresa.
Well, thanks, Frank, for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. I hope our viewers, wherever, maybe on YouTube, maybe here on Zoom, enjoyed the discussion as well. And yeah, Frank, do you want to say something? Last points or something? Is there anything you want to note?
No, just maybe catch our final event this evening, 5 o'clock Brussels time, 4 o'clock UK time, with Joseph Stiglitz and Marco Butti. We'll be discussing fiscal rules and the future of the fiscal framework, followed by a nice live panel.
Great. That was it. Yeah, I hope to see everyone somewhere soon.
And thank you so much to you all. Next time
Thank you for the organization.
Yeah.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.